Isso é Telsiea. It took me a moment to remember my Halcomelum. Welcome, friends. We're so glad you're joining us again. And hello to Sarah. Today we are chatting about holistic engagement with story and making meaning and how teachers can support that. And my name is Nikki Yi, and I am a colonizer of Mennonite and Chinese ancestry. And I am joining you today from the traditional and unceded territory, contemporary territory of the Q'um peoples.
Hello, and I'm Sarah Davidson. I am Haida and European ancestry, and I am joining you from the unceded territories of the Katzie, the Kwantlen, and the Semiahmoo.
Awesome. So today I am interviewing Sarah. She has some great ideas and activities that can really kind of support us in terms of teaching from that perspective of holistic engagement with story. And so I'm really excited to ask you some questions and yeah, to just deepen my own learning and hopefully can support other people too. So just to start off, maybe you can talk to us a bit about like what is holistic engagement? What's that sort of experience of being holistically engaged?
So that actually came from I was listening to a video or watching a video that I'm going to use Q'um Q'um Xiiem, but that is the traditional name of Dr. Joanne Archibald. So when you hear me say Q'um Q'um Xiiem, that's who I'm talking about. And so I was listening to this video, I was reviewing some things for a class, and she just very briefly mentioned engaging with stories holistically. And she mentioned mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual listening. And I just sort of kind of caught it as a little, she just sort of said it in passing. And I really found it to be a very helpful idea for me to think about when we're talking about engaging with stories and learning from stories. And I think when we think about kind of traditionally, just if I was to read a story to a class, we think about that listening, we think about maybe engaging through kind of comprehension approach. And I felt this idea of holistic engagement with story kind of broadened my understanding of the ways that we can learn from story and not just limiting it to one way. And so I actually had a bit of a conversation with her and said, "Hey, are you okay if I kind of expand on this idea a bit more? I feel like it could be really helpful for educators who are trying to understand the a kind of a different approach to learning through, learning through stories and learning from stories, and to be thinking beyond that way that I will say when I was in school, the way I was sort of engaging with stories." And she seemed happy about that. And so I kind of worked with it a bit more and started to think about how could I develop a way to support students to think, about how, and when I say students, I was working at that time with teacher candidates, and I was thinking about how can I support them to think about the ways that they work with stories. So when we're thinking about um, traditional stories, that was part of the work that I was doing, and the protocols associated with working with traditional stories, I found that our default mode is to continue to go with what we've learned. And so I was seeing students kind of doing comprehension type questions with those stories, and I felt really uncomfortable about that. It felt like it was reducing the story to just the words on a page, perhaps, or just the particular story, and not thinking more broadly about the story. And so I felt that that idea of engaging holistically offered a broader framework to be able to think about how we were learning from these stories. And
And so
yeah, I think, sorry.
can I ask like, so I've like you, I've experienced that sort of, the teacher reads a story and kind of asks those comprehension questions. And for learners, like, how does it feel different? Like, what's different about being holistically engaged? Like, how do I know that I'm holistically engaging? You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. I think I'm going to go back to my own experiences as a student. I felt that when I was a student in a class, especially in my English classes, I felt like the teacher was looking for a very specific answer. And I felt that if I didn't have that answer that they were looking for, and I need to tell you, I was always completely mystified about whatever answer they came to. um, and like I had a very different experiences growing up, and the knowledge and experiences that I was bringing to a class. So I was always, it sort of felt like I was trying to memorize what I'm supposed to be taking or understanding from a story. And so what I appreciate about this approach is it feels more invitational to build on the strengths and the skills and the knowledges that students are bringing into a classroom or into this a learning experience. And so I don't know necessarily that. I guess the little kind of quick check would be if I'm asking a question and I think I know the answer, probably I'm not doing it, because the idea is that we are building upon the individual students' strengths and experiences and knowledges that they're bringing. So I shouldn't be able to anticipate the kinds of answers I might receive. And if I do have a kind of really precise answer, then probably I need to rethink the kinds of questions that I'm asking in order to engage in the conversation. And so, in terms of holistic, when she talked about that mental and physical and emotional and spiritual, um, this idea of mentally, I feel like that is sort of the, listening to the story, hearing what the story is. And so that is something we're very familiar with. The idea of physical engagement with a story was a bit confusing to me, and I'm like, oh, how do we do that? How do we? And that maybe because I'm not, I am elementary trained, but I taught at high school. And emotional engagement with the story, I think we're sort of familiar with that, but this, really valuing that is a different approach. And then the spiritual connection was really kind of further for me. And so as I was working with those ideas, I was thinking about, like, how do I break this down into something? And I kind of came with these ideas, sort of like, okay, mental is listening to the story being told. Physical was thinking about drama and thinking about this kind of physical reenactment of a part of the story. And emotional was reflecting on the story and really thinking about what I was learning from the story. And thinking about, how do the characters interact with one another? What are they learning? How does that connect? And then spiritual is this sort of idea of what is the story teaching us? And I struggled with the physical engagement. So where I went was Q'um Q'um Xiiem had developed these resources called, nope, I've lost it, Justice, Journeys for Justice.
Yeah, yeah.
And in that, she had just some suggestions that are so timely and relevant about how to work with stories. And one of them was this idea of engaging physically. And so I thought, okay, well, let's test that out, because what I had been doing was, sharing a story. We would listen, and we would listen. We'd have a circle. We'd all talk about what we learned from the story. People would hear from each other and be like, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about it in that way. Um, and and then, sort of go away, maybe thinking about the story a bit differently. If I had the chance, or if they had the chance to encounter the story again, they might take something new based on the lived experiences they had at that particular time, maybe reflecting back on something that someone else had said. But it was the adding of the physical engagement with the story that was really quite transformational in ways that I could not have anticipated. And so it sort of began with thinking about, like, okay, how do we do this? How do we physically engage? Because I didn't want it to be a reenactment. Like, I really feel like there are so many protocols, and that is a whole other episode, the protocols connected
Yeah.
with traditional stories. But I really didn't want to trivialize the stories and have them just be these kind of reenactments. So I believe in one of the videos she just talked about, or it may have been in the Journeys for Justice, where there's this idea of either reenacting a part of the story or kind of imagining what happens next in the story. And so this physical engagement with the story was really about making meaning as opposed to a reenactment of the story, which would probably not be appropriate if we didn't have that kind of permission.
That's so interesting. And can I ask, like, what kind of like structures did you put in place to kind of, or like, how did you scaffold that type of engagement? Like, what kind of structures did you put in place to ensure that students are really honoring the story? Like, that was kind of like I've done a bit of physical, work with story as well, and I just felt like it didn't. I think we've talked about it before. It
Yeah,
didn't
I was
work
going to
really well.
say.
And so I'm just thinking now, oh my gosh, like, there maybe I should have put some boundaries in place. So like, can I ask, like,
Yeah.
how did you sort of scaffold students into that engagement and also like encourage them to really honor the story in a, respectful way, I guess?
Yeah, so I failed epically, and we did talk about that previously. And I found myself in the moment I was watching what the students were doing, and I thought, ooh, this is on me. I didn't set up enough structures to sort of support them to engage um, respectfully. I felt like, and it definitely it was not them intentionally being disrespectful. It was just I realized very quickly that I hadn't put the appropriate parameters on the activity and really talked about why it was so important. So a couple things that I do. One is that I do have an expectation that everybody's involved, but it's not. They don't have to share it with the broader class. They can
Mm.
participate within their small group. If the stretch for them is to just be a tree and partly or a rock or something, that is okay. They can decide for themselves what is the stretch for them to be able to participate. I do ask that they all participate, but again, they don't have to share that with the broader class. It can just be, which for me really focuses the intention on because the conversations that they have to develop whatever they're going to do
Mm.
really pushes them to engage more deeply with the story and understand what's really going on in this. What is at the heart? How do we represent that? So they have to deepen their understanding. And so there is that. And then the last thing I do is I also invite them to imagine that the person who gave permission for us to work with the story is in the
Mm.
room with us. And so they then, they're aware that that it's not just sort of a kind of free for all. It's that we would want that person to feel good about the fact that they gave us permission to work with this story. And that also
Mhm.
really helped. And it's not that we don't have fun. It's not that we don't enjoy ourselves, but that we do um, uh, that we're aware that somebody has given us or a community has given us permission to work with this story, and that we want to uphold our responsibilities in accepting the opportunity to work with that story.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And so do you have an example of maybe like an activity or an approach to sort of planning
Yeah, so
these kinds of activities?
what I'm going to do, I'm going to share an activity template, and I'll just I think we're probably going to end with this. So what I'll offer beforehand is that this template was kind of refined, if you will, for a professional development series that may be of interest to folks, the Indigenous arts practices, and we'll put the link below. And so this one it's called the activity idea template. So there we are. I'm hoping that you can see that. And
Hmm.
um, so what I was struggling with was how do we develop these kinds of activities in a different way. I think when we develop lesson plans, we've got these very specific learning outcomes, and we've got these very specific approaches, and how do we assess? And this was really about shifting our thinking about how do we engage. And so this is sort of a template, if you will, to sort of think through differently. You don't need to do it in this order. You might find that it works for you. And there are videos on the Indigenous arts practices, talking through both this template, if you're interested in a more detailed explanation, and also kind of thinking about planning with that. So Dr. Laura D'Amico worked with me on this particular part of that professional development series, and we talked about this. And so you'll see on the activity phase, there's sort of an optional background, depending on what folks have for background: learn, explore, respond, and share. And so you'll see here, I'm not going to read all of the descriptions, but you'll see, you can pause your video and just see that there are these different descriptions. And you'll see also that there are some guiding questions. And this was developed for an art form, so specific, to arts practices. But if we think about the storytelling, this is an arts practice. And so that was the example I chose. And you'll see that kind of the sequence of the activity I've been sort of describing. So talking a little bit about the story work principles, which we've talked about in previous videos, sharing this particular story about Lady Louse, which I find to be really helpful because it is a different kind of story. Story arc. And so one that's unfamiliar to folks, and ensuring that they are just familiar that lots of different stories have different story arcs. And then inviting students to engage physically with drama activities, with the story. And then we come back to a bigger circle. And if all the people in the group want to share, they're welcome to share within that circle, just share what they had prepared, what they'd worked through. And again, I make it very clear that folks can opt out of that part, so that there's, just based on what the student stretch is. And then we share at the end what we learned from that story. And what I found when I compared to just having a conversation, to what the insights that folks had as a result of that physical engagement, it was really, really notable in terms of the differences. So I found it to be a useful activity to do, but also, and I think it's one that I feel comfortable, if we have permission to work with the story, it is one that I think Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators can take up for sure.
So I just have to ask you one last question
Okay.
because it just came up. So if non-Indigenous teachers are taking up story, how can they do it in a way that is not appropriation or is not disrespectful? So, they want to kind of, do it in a good way. And do you have any kind of suggestions for those teachers?
I think definitely kind of doing homework first. So when I say that, I just mean, like, I think we talked about reviewing resources, making sure that the story we're bringing in. And so we don't have to do this particular activity with traditional stories first. We can work with other stories, and sometimes that's a better place for folks if they want to work with a Scotta story, for instance. If they want to work with those stories, to do this kind of work first, so that they're not engaged with stories that may have protocols. And so it's a nice way to kind of practice a different approach for making meaning from story with a lower risk. So I would start with that. And I would also work closely with, I don't know, whatever supports you have for Indigenous education within your district, within your institution, because there are definitely local protocols to attend to. There are story protocols to attend to. And so I would say that this particular story that I shared, the Lady Louse story, is one that the storyteller that shared it with Q'um Q'um Xiiem gave permission for it to be used in an educational context. So it is one that folks could probably practice with. And if they're really uncomfortable, I would suggest starting with other books first, because there's nothing that says you're not allowed to do this particular practice of making meaning or engaging holistic with story with other stories, and it can only be traditional stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I just have my eyes on the time. And
Yes.
Sarah, I just always have so many questions when we talk because you are such a fountain of knowledge and wisdom.
Okay. Well, more on
So,
that next time. More to share next time.
And I'm sorry I didn't have my copy of Jigging for Halibut with
It's
Ginny
okay.
available to show up.
Oh, 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 here we go.
Okay, here it is. Has to make an appearance.
There we go.
There's the Scata stories.
Okay, we'll see you next time.
Thanks. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks so much, friends.